Sorry, I thought I saw something outside. I didn't. It's fine. Hello plant pals and welcome to another video. My name is Kenna and I'm so excited to have you here with me today. Today we are going to be answering some of your most asked plant questions. So if you guys are anything like most plant parents, when you first start out getting houseplants or first start out getting plants in general, you make a lot of mistakes and there are a lot of things that your plants do that might be a little bit weird, and you look them up on Google. So I have compiled a list of some of the most common houseplant questions and we're going to go ahead and answer them today. So if you like this kind of video, leave me a thumbs up, and without further ado, let's get into it. So the first question I have on my list here is, why is my plant turning yellow? And there are a couple of answers to this question that seem a little bit conflicting, but with a little bit more detail, I think you guys will understand. The first is overwatering and the second is underwatering. Typically, symptoms of underwatering is soil that's dry for long extended periods and then the leaves turn yellow. Because they don't have enough water, they don't have enough nutrients, there's nothing really in the soil for the roots to pull up. So they start turning yellow. It starts killing off leaves to try to save some of that energy the plant has been putting in, maintaining those older leaves. So usually the older leaves will be the first to drop in an underwatering scenario. And they can get a little bit crispy. So usually it's not like soggy death, it's usually a very dry death. The other option is overwatering. And overwatering can be a little bit tricky for a lot of people because, sorry, Luna just kicked the computer or the stand here. But overwatering can be a little bit tricky for a lot of people because some people think, well, my plant's really dry, I should water it, and then they start seeing the symptoms. And the other is like a long period of overwatering. And overwatering is typically more moisture in the soil than the plant can uptake in a normal period of time. So if you have underwatered your plant for a long period of time and then you suddenly drench them with water, you're gonna overwater because this roots that were in that soil previously may have had time to die off. There won't be anything in that soil to uptake that water, uptake those nutrients, and actually dry out that soil. So it's gonna be sitting in that soggy, boggy soil, and that's a huge problem. The other one, of course, is somebody who, kind of conflates water with love when it comes to their plants and waters their plants far too frequently. And that frequent volume of water keeps that soil moist at all times. There are some plants that like to stay a little bit on the more moist side, but as a general rule, most plants do like to dry out a little bit between waterings. So those are kind of the two main ways that you can kind of encounter overwatering. And I would just always be very cautious of, adding more water into a pot that's already a little bit damp or already has a little bit of moisture in that soil, because you don't want to be causing your plant to sit in moisture for a long time. It can foster that bacteria that can cause root rot. So those are kind of the two main ones usually, and I've heard this said other places, I'm not really sure where, I apologize. But if it is a dry death, I consider that to be underwatering, and if it's a wet, soggy, boggy death, it is overwatering. So those are kind of two things to keep in mind, and both of these can cause yellowing leaves. So if you see yellowing leaves on your plant, just kind of think about your watering habits. If your plant has had time to dry out way too much, or if it is super, super damp and you can't figure out why it's not pulling up that water, uptaking that water, you probably have a watering issue. So that's what I would think about when I see yellowing leaves. All right, and the next question on our list here is kind of similar, and I say that because the cause tends to be fairly kind of comparable to the yellowing leaves, and that is, why is my plant wilting or drooping? So this one I would more attribute to underwatering than I would overwatering, depending on the situation. If you notice that your plant's leaves are really limp or hanging a little bit lower than they normally would, and your soil is dry, I would say give your plant a drink. That's your plant signaling that it is thirsty, it needs water, and it's a good thing to pay attention to as a plant parent, to kind of see where your plant's leaves naturally hang out, and if they're showing a little bit more limpness or a little bit less stiffness in those leaves, there's probably a problem. And it's one that can be, pretty easily rectified. The other way around, though, is a little bit more difficult, and that is if your plant is limp and droopy and it has water. And that is where we get into, once again, the over-watering situation. And I feel like some people talk about this, but maybe not as many as I would expect. If you are a chronic underwaterer and your root system and your plants are dying back, because that does happen when you underwater, your plant starts killing off things that aren't necessarily necessary to the survival and the function of the plant. So as that root system starts dying off, your plant has much less surface area and much less ability to actually suck up and draw up that water and that moisture. So if your plant soil has been damp for at least a few days and it is still droopy, still limp, I would definitely check on those roots. Because that is probably a sign that there is something going on. Those roots are not healthy, those roots are not happy, and unfortunately that could mean that you may have root rot. Sorry, I thought I saw something outside. I didn't, it's fine. But that's unfortunately one of the signs that you could have root rot in your plant. It's one of the signs that maybe your pot is too big for your plant because it doesn't have enough roots to actually fill up that pot and to take up the moisture in that pot effectively. But it's just a really good thing to check out in that case. Just kind of keep in mind, again, what your watering habits are, when you last watered this plant, and if it could need water, go ahead and give it a drink. And if you think that something else is going on here, I just watered it, definitely take a look at the roots, because unfortunately root rot can kill a plant pretty quickly, and you can be left with a stub or a little bit of stem to try to be growing back from. And take it from me, that can be difficult on a plant that's already stressed. So if your plant is drooping or wilting, just think about what it needs and see what you can do to remedy that situation before it becomes a long-term issue or becomes something that might ultimately kill off your plant. All right, and the next question we have here is, why is my plant turning brown? So in my collection, for me, most of the time when I have browning leaves, they are the oldest leaves on the plant. And this is pretty common as a plant is growing. It's devoting its energy to the new growth in that plant. And the older leaves are gonna start dying off because they're not necessarily needed anymore. So I want you to think about an understory situation. That is where a lot of our houseplants grow, is underneath the canopy of the forest, on the floor of a forest or a heavily treed environment. And the leaves at the bottom are going to be getting the least light. So as your plant is growing up and up and up, it's shadowing out the leaves on the bottom, and those leaves tend to die off quicker because they are no longer really functional for the plant. So if you've kind of looked at the other things that might be causing a problem, like watering issues, and your plant is just kind of losing those older leaves, and it's not all at once, it's not like an overwhelming amount, it's just like one, maybe two, especially at the change of a season, I would say browning leaves really aren't that big of a concern. If they're losing them in copious amounts, or it's at a really unusual time, or just something else is going on, definitely take a peek at things like your watering and even your fertilizing habits. There are certain plants that will actually yellow off their leaves and start turning crispy and crunchy and brown, simply because they don't have the amount of fertilizer that they need. So if everything else is in order, I would say maybe try giving your plant a nice little boost of fertilizer and make sure that you're doing whatever you can to keep your plant happy. But otherwise, I don't really think that browning leaves are that concerning, as long as it's not too many. All right, and the next one I will say actually did give me a little bit of a chuckle, and that is, why are my leaves crying? And I laugh because I didn't realize this was a thing until I had houseplants, because I really didn't have any experience with plants that did this. But I think what they're talking about is these little droplets of what almost looks like dew or sap, typically on the backs of leaves or on the stem of a leaf. Philodendrons, certain ones like the gloriosum, are really known for doing this, and that is actually those little bits of sap are actually coming from their extra floral nectaries, or their EFNs. And that is kind of where the plants lets off additional moisture. So if you've just watered a plant, you are going to likely notice that there is a little bit more copious production of EFN. And actually this plant here, this is my Mexicanum, does have a few little dots of that moisture, and it's pretty sticky and kind of sappy. So that's kind of a good way to tell that that's what you're looking at, and it's not like water or anything like that. However, something to be cautious of with this type of sap is it can burn your plants really, really easily. So if your plants are in a bright light location and they are producing a lot of EFN, they actually can burn, and you will actually see little extraflora nectary burns on your plant's leaves, sometimes on the stems. And it's nothing to be overly concerned about in most general situations. There are plants, like I said, that produce it more than others. I've heard that, what is it? The Philodendron Splendid. There we go. I've heard that the Philodendron Splendid is pretty bad with this one. I think the Philodendron melanochrysum is known for being pretty bad. My Mexicanum definitely is. My gloriosum, which is sitting over here, it definitely is. I believe my Philodendron Burl Marks variegated also had a little bit of EFN production going on, and it's pretty normal. Like I said, as long as your plant is otherwise healthy and appears happy, I wouldn't really be concerned about it. Especially if you've just watered. Like I said, it's a good way for the plant to kind of let out extra moisture and prevent any damage to your plants from holding on to the extra moisture, which can cause edema, soggy, like weird bubblies on your leaves, and you don't really want any of that to happen. However, and I do say this just kind of as a heads up, if you have a plant that is producing either a lot of extra EFN or that is just all of a sudden started producing EFN, definitely closely inspect those leaves, because one of the functions of EFN, aside from just letting out that extra moisture, is actually thought to attract insects like ants and other like predatory insects that can take care of a pest problem on a plant. So you actually might have pests on that plant, and that plant is trying to signal to nearby insects to come and help with that pest problem. So if your plant has like spider mites or mealybugs or thrips, just take a quick look, because it might actually have that additional EFN production as a function of its trying to defend itself, essentially. So while I normally wouldn't be worried about EFN production, and it is totally normal for some plants to actually produce a good amount of EFN, if you notice an uptick or you notice anything changing, just take a quick peek, make sure that everything's good. And I will also say, since I did mention that it can burn your plants if left on, I do usually rinse mine off. It's usually really easy to rinse off, honestly, just under some lukewarm water. I would say just spray it off, and usually it comes right off. It dissolves because it's a lot of sugar essentially in water, and your plants will not be harmed. So that's usually what I would recommend, but I don't really have any worries about EFN. All right, the next question on our list is, why is my plant's soil molding or turning white? And this is one that I think freaks a lot of people out, especially if it's like a new thing and you've never like seen this before. I don't think any of my plants currently have mold, but that's usually what you would see in this type of situation where like it's turning white or it's molding. Is it's just a layer of surface mold. Most of the time it's not harmful. Most of the time it's not going to hurt your plants. If you wanted to change out your soil, I mean, you definitely could. I wouldn't necessarily say it's necessary unless you're noticing an issue. There are actually, though, some brands of soil that this is more of an issue with than others. Miracle-Gro or other like big box brand type soils tend to be pretty high on that list. You will see a lot of moisture retentive soils having mold because they're holding on to moisture for a long time, and that's a pretty ideal environment for mold to be growing in. So when you're adding in, soil amendments, if you are the type of person who does that, that can help a little bit because it helps that soil to be a little bit more fast draining, helps it to not be so compacted and hold on to so much moisture. But for the most part, it's not really a concern. In fact, if you guys have ever seen me repot a plant, I do actually use mica, which is mycorrhizal, and it is a beneficial fungus, for lack of a better phrasing, that you add into your soil with the purpose of creating that symbiotic relationship between the fungus and your plant. And it actually makes your plants more resilient. It does help with root growth, helps with reducing shock, helps make them more pest resistant. It does a lot of really great things. And I'm not saying every plant mold is going to do the same things. They probably don't. I know that there's specific strains that are more beneficial, but for the most part, they're pretty harmless. If aesthetically you dislike it, I've seen people put cinnamon on their soil tops. I haven't tried that. You can. I've also seen people use peroxide to water through their plants. And while you absolutely can do this, and it's honestly most of the time not going to hurt your plant as long as you dilute it properly, I personally don't choose to do this because it actually can kill off some of the beneficial bugs or beneficial, fungi or whatever you have living in your plant. And it's going to really drastically change the little microenvironment that your plant has been growing in. And I don't want to do that. I have I think I have beneficial bugs. I've seen a few of them. I don't have a ton of them. I haven't intentionally introduced them, but I have beneficial bugs in my collection, in the soil, like nematodes, things like that. And those can be really great for your plants. They help to, recycle waste. They help to prevent pests. They do a lot of really great things. So I choose to just let my plants be. If it grows mold, it grows mold. I'm really not that concerned. But if you are, another thing you can try, again, and I don't really do this, but you can let your plants dry out a little bit more than you typically would if you do spot mold, because if your soil is not consistently moist, it actually should cause the mold to die off because it's no longer that perfect environment for the mold or fungus to grow. But I'm not really worried about it. Like I said, I, as a normal houseplant parent who does occasionally underwater, do not have any mold issues in my collection currently. And I feel like with a normal, mix of soil and a normal watering kind of situation, you probably shouldn't face any issues. But if you do, those are what you can do for it. All right, and the next question we have is, why is my plant dropping leaves? And I do kind of want to refer back a little bit to the answers for the browning leaves and the yellowing leaves, because I feel like both of those are probably going to be pretty applicable in the situation. Once your plant starts yellowing off a leaf, that leaf is not going to turn green again. That leaf is going to stay yellow or brown, and it's going to continue to die off. It's unfortunately not something that you can reverse time on. So if your plant has already yellowing or browning leaves, it's probably going to drop those leaves eventually. However, if your plant is not just going through the normal process of dropping off leaves, or it's not just underwatered, I would actually be pretty concerned about a ton of leaf drop. To me, a bunch of leaves dropping all at once really indicates something is going on that is stressing out that plant. And either it's a watering issue, maybe a pest issue, but that plant is trying to signal that something is wrong. And I feel like probably the best example of this is with succulents. They tend to drop their leaves off easily, at the snap of any sort of problems. They'll start dropping leaves, and that's to help preserve the plant. So if your plant starts dropping leaves, like I said, just kind of refer back to your watering, see kind of what's going on with that. And if not, there's definitely something going on. So start kind of going through your checklist. Are there any pests? What does your fertilizer regimen look like? Is it getting enough light? Because if your plant's not getting enough light, it will start dropping those leaves as well, because it's having to put energy into sustaining all of those leaves. So if your plant isn't getting enough energy from light or fertilizer, it will drop their leaves to try to preserve the health of the rest of the plant. And unfortunately, when that happens, your plant stops looking quite as nice and attractive, because the bare stem at the bottom is just a stick with usually some leaves on top. I do have a couple that kind of look that way right now. But yes, if you do see dropping leaves, definitely pay attention to that plant, see kind of what's going on and what you can do to kind of improve your situation. So when it comes to dropping leaves, just kind of pay attention to what your plant's looking for. For a lot of plants, there is, updated, detailed information online with, care instructions for that plant. Every now and then when I have a plant that's kind of puzzling me, will give that a read through and just see if I am adequately fulfilling all my plant's needs. And if there's something that I notice is off, that's kind of what I would look at first. So dropping leaves are a call for help, but it's not necessarily something you can't fix as long as you take appropriate action. So the last question that we have on our list today is, why is my plant full of gnats? And this one, if you are a plant parent, you've probably encountered a fungus gnat infestation a time or two. And unfortunately, they are so difficult to get rid of, and they will drive a lot of your plant parents up the wall because they're so annoying. They don't really bother me too much. My boyfriend Christopher really hates them, and things flying around in the house, like bugs, he just can't stand. So while I probably could have lived with them, I did have to actually find a way to eliminate the problem as best I could. And I do actually have a couple tips for you guys, but first I want to talk about the cause of a fungus gnat infestation. And for a lot of plant parents, I feel like it's kind of a similar story. So there are a lot of brands out there of easily available potting soil that you can get at your big box stores, like Miracle-Gro, for example, that are known to have a lot of fungus gnats larvae in them. So when you bring them into your home and you introduce them into your plants, you get fungus gnats. And then once you have one or two, it is so hard to get rid of them entirely because they continue to lay eggs and breed in your plants until they're everywhere. So even if it's just one plant, you probably are going to have fungus gnats in every plant if you don't take action quickly. If you ever do notice fungus gnats, the first thing I personally would do is put that plant outside if you can, away from the rest of your plants. That way the fungus gnats are cut off from their avenue of spreading, because they do lay eggs in the soil and they produce and breed in the soil, which is why it's so difficult to get rid of them, because it's not like, they're on the leaves of your plants, and usually spraying down your plants with like pesticides or things like that does nothing for fungus gnats, because they live in the soil and they don't really eat your plant. Typically they eat dead plant matter and just kind of different decaying matter in your plant soil, but not actually the plant itself. So while they're not necessarily pests, they are incredibly irritating. So what I personally have found is to really helpful for fungus gnats is, number one, if you are buying the big box brand of soils, just kind of keep an eye on it. Make sure that if you are using it immediately, I would maybe separate those plants for just a few days, just to make sure that you don't see any fungus gnats kind of hanging around. But I also, if I can, actually let that soil dry out before I use it. Once soil has dried out, the larvae and the fungus gnat eggs and all of that dry out, and they actually will die off. Fungus gnats only want to live in moist soil. They don't want to live in dry soil. So letting your soil kind of dry out before you use it is actually a great way of preventing the spread of a fungus gnat infestation. If you have a plant that's already infested with fungus gnats, as I said earlier, you can use peroxide. I choose not to do that, but I have seen people who do, and I have heard that people have had success with it. What I actually chose to do though was mosquito dunks, and a lot of people I feel like have heard of this at this point, but mosquito dunks, when you soak them in the water that you're watering your plants with and create mosquito dunk tea, actually have a bacteria in them. It's I believe it's DT or BT, I forget what it's actually called. I don't have any mosquito dunks on hand right now, but it actually is a bacteria that will infect the fungus gnat larvae, and it actually will kill them off. And it's pretty effective, but it does take a lot of time to work, unfortunately. which is the part that can get frustrating because there's really not an immediate fix for fungus gnats. It is something that does take time. It takes, I believe their life cycle is about 3 weeks, if I remember right. It's been a long time since I've read about fungus gnats, but their life cycle is pretty short. Even then, though, you do need to actually consistently water with your mosquito dunks over a long period. I would say at least 2 months to really see a marked improvement in your fungus gnat population. However, there is another thing you can do supplementally that does help decrease immediately the population, and that is something like a catchy or one of those like blue purple lights bug attractive catches or traps. I do actually have one over in my corner here. I ordered it for houseflies originally. It does not work for houseflies at all, but it works great for fungus gnats. And because, especially at night when it's dark, the fungus gnats are attracted to it, it does eliminate the adult population fairly successfully. So I feel like that, in addition to the mosquito dunks, does address the full life cycle of the fungus gnat in such a way that it helps to reduce your population in a short time span and prevents having a ton of fungus gnat problems. The other thing that you can do, and this is also something that is advised, is to water less frequently. Because as I said, if your soil dries out, the fungus gnats no longer find that to be a hospitable environment in which to raise their young. So they will not lay eggs in that soil, and if there are any eggs in it, they will dry out, they will die off. And that really helps a lot. Okay, so I think that is it for today's video. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and leave them down below. Like I said, these were just the most common ones that I kind of found on Google, and ones that I've kind of run into myself as well, that I've had to kind of find out the answers to as I've become a more experienced plant parent. But if you like this kind of video, like I said, leave me a thumbs up, leave me a comment down below. I would love to hear from you guys. And there is a subscribe button down there as well. I do try to post new videos weekly, and I would love to see you guys around more often. But I think that's about it. So thanks so much. Bye.